How do you take an established property that the average gamer completes in around 30 to 40 hours and turn that into a trilogy, each part of which should take around the same amount of time to complete as the original game? In the realm of video games, even though remakes and reboots have become common, it's a question that has never really been answered before. And even in the wider realm of entertainment, there are few examples, with perhaps the most well-known being The Hobbit. For Square Enix, this means they're venturing into uncharted territory. And over the past 4 years, fans around the world have been on tenterhooks, waiting to see how Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will build upon what was established within the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's why you're no doubt here, and we hope to answer as many questions as possible as we run through our critical impressions of Rebirth with a focus around gameplay, structure, presentation and story in our typical granular style. But because there are so many sensitivities around this particular game and the wider project in general, we will try to keep everything as spoiler-free as possible. To be clear, as there are numerous definitions about what spoiler-free means, here's our definition. We will not be discussing any crucial story events in detail. For that, we ask that you wait until after Rebirth is launched, when we will take the gloves off for some full-on spoiler discussion. Anything we do discuss around the story in this video will be towards the end of the review, and it will be kept ambiguous so as to allow everyone to enjoy it on their own terms. We will also not be showing any footage we have captured while playing through the full game. Everything you see in this video will be public domain footage released or captured by Square Enix. As the recent state of play was also riddled with content that towed the spoiler line, we will also limit usage of footage from that broadcast. If you're still worried though, we'd recommend 2 courses of action. 1. Listen to the video without watching any of the visuals. Or 2. Come back later once you've played the game to see if your thoughts align with ours. For transparency, it should also be noted that Square Enix did provide a free copy of the game for purposes of review, and we played on normal difficulty using active mode. Alright, with that out of the way, let's mosey.
Alright, let's get this show on the road, people!
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth adopts many of the core gameplay mechanics that were so well defined within the Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's a case of evolution, as opposed to revolution. This means Rebirth sits firmly in the action role-playing game genre, and the numerous elements that pulled from the franchise's illustrious past and were so well received 4 years ago, such as the adapted ATB system, party management, materia, and the stagger system, all return. The slick and responsive controls have also been retained, and this means that if you enjoy playing as Cloud or Tifa within Remake, or even Yuffie within Episode Intermission, you'll be able to pick up where you left off and continue to enjoy playing as Cloud, Tifa or Yuffie within Rebirth. With so much of the heavy lifting already accomplished, focus has therefore been placed around making tweaks and adjustments, and ensuring that any new additions to the battle system are seen to have been given the same level of care and consideration. And perhaps the most interesting aspect in that regard comes via Aerith. Whereas every other character who appeared in association with Remake has seen their gameplay remain quite consistent between the 2 games, Aerith has undergone something of a rework. In Remake, Aerith was a spellcaster whose abilities could deal considerable magic damage to enemies and also aid the party. One of these abilities was Fleeting Familiar, which would summon a fairy that would act as an extension of Aerith's damage dealing capabilities. Alongside these abilities, Aerith also had access to Tempest, which could deal varieties of magic damage depending on whether it was charged and whether the projectiles exploded as intended. For Rebirth, elements of Tempest and Fleeting Familiar have been combined with Aerith's standard attack, and the spaces vacated have been filled by a new standard ability called Ward Shift and a new ATB ability called Radiance Ward. Part of Aerith's strengths came from her ability to lay down wards. These would buff anyone standing within the area of effect, allowing them to charge their ATB gauges faster or double cast. Ward Shift now allows Aerith to teleport to any of the placed wards in an instant, and the intention here has been to provide Aerith with more mobility. By making this change, it means Aerith can now more effectively avoid damage from enemies that telegraph moves without having to try and run or evade, neither of which Aerith was particularly adept at. With many of the other characters only undergoing minor adjustments, maximum effort was placed around crafting dynamic gameplay styles for the two other main party members who will join the fray, Red 13 and Cait Sith. One of the major challenges faced by having such a large cast of characters is the requirement for them to all feel unique. The original game achieved this with excellent form, as Cloud, Tifa, Aerith and Barrett each had diverse gameplay mechanics that catered to numerous playstyles. And when Yuffie was added to the mix, she provided a blend of fast-paced melee action that was capable of adjusting distance in a split second with a high degree of magical proficiency. Despite the diversity on display, Red 13 and Cait Sith don't feel superfluous. Instead, they feel necessary by filling gaps that were not glaring, but needed to be filled. Red 13, for example, serves as a far more natural tank than Barrett was capable of being within Remake. As such, Red 13 has a playstyle geared around soaking up damage and then dishing out retribution via his Vengeance ability. But even though this makes Red 13 seem like some kind of aggressor, he's more akin to a pseudo-paladin. Perhaps the clearest piece of evidence comes via the Sentinel stance ability. This serves as a prominent paladin ability in Final Fantasy XI and XIV, and just as in those games, it makes Red 13's guarding more effective by increasing Vengeance charge. Vengeance can then be spent on healing allies, increasing their ATB charging, or even granting haste. Cait Sith, on the other hand, embodies the missing notion of organised chaos. Each of the existing characters has quite defined roles and responsibilities, but Final Fantasy has often been notorious for having that one character who exudes randomness. Cait Sith provides this in abundance. Part of the challenge around Cait Sith is that its gameplay style is adaptive and evolutionary in nature. For example, Cait Sith doesn't have access to the giant robotic Moogle by default. It has to instead be earned. Once called forth, numerous possibilities then arise. Cait Sith can, for example, choose to disconnect from the Moogle and have it serve as an independent distraction that has its own HP gauge. Or, Cait Sith can ride the Moogle to double up on damage by dealing both standard physical and magical attacks at the same time. Certain ATB abilities are also locked out unless the Moogle is present, and each of them has a specific quirk that is unlike anything seen elsewhere in the game, and it takes full advantage of what the Moogle means to Cait Sith. Each of the characters, whether old or new, is tied together via the multifaceted character progression systems. Many of these systems are inherited from the original game, such as the standard leveling, material upgrades, and the learning of new abilities by fulfilling specific proficiency requirements when obtaining a new weapon. But one of the other core systems has been reworked. Each weapon in Remake could be upgraded through a unique customization system. This meant that unlike many other role-playing games, including the original Final Fantasy VII, where weapons are often superseded and rendered useless upon acquiring new ones, in Remake, even starter weapons could be useful during the end game. It just depended on the playstyle the player wanted to adopt and how they were upgraded. This overriding sentiment has been retained for Rebirth. Each weapon has a different ratio between physical and magical damage, and this is then balanced with subtle differences with materia slot configurations and weapon skills. Manuscripts remain central to this, but weapon upgrading has now been simplified. Focus is instead placed on a new overriding progression system that links folios and manuscripts, but also the new party level. As the party level increases, new skills, abilities and attributes become available within each character's folio, and it's down to the player to determine how they wish to navigate through the grid. The main motivation behind this change seems to be to provide permanent character enhancements as opposed to them being locked behind specific interchangeable weapons. And on that basis, it's a welcome change. But the weapon upgrade system that's still there does end up feeling a bit underwhelming as a result. The other major change of the folio system comes via a wider enhancement to gameplay. Amongst the developers, there must have been an appreciation that sometimes, depending on party setup, players will encounter situations that they are just not prepared for. Quite often this would come via an elemental weakness needing to be exploited, but either none of the available characters would have the appropriate materia equipped, or they no longer had enough MP to cast the required spells. To compensate, each character can now learn elemental specific abilities via the folio system that cost no MP to use. They simply require 1 ATB bar. The other focal point of the folio system comes via synergy. An iteration of the synergy mechanic was introduced via episode intermission. The idea was to have an existing ability be enhanced by having both members of the party spend resources to join together. As there were only 2 characters, this system could be managed via the ATB system with minimal fuss. But with Rebirth having a party of 3 and 7 playable characters in total, the synergy system was reworked into something much more sophisticated. One aspect of this manifests through synergy abilities. As the folio expands, it will be possible to purchase synergy abilities that allow 2 specific characters to pool their resources together to deal increased damage and provide some kind of buff. It means abilities must now be learned before they can be used, but the application also differs. Each time an ATB bar is spent, characters will accrue synergy, and only when both characters accrue enough synergy will they be able to use a synergy ability. The benefits are clear, as the perks include unlocking a higher level of limit break or gaining unlimited MP or 3 ATB bars for a short period of time. The downside of this modification, in comparison to how the system was implemented in Intermission, is that it's an extra step of micromanagement. Before, Yuffie and Sonon just needed to have enough ATB, and as Sonon wasn't playable, players only had to worry about managing Yuffie. Now, to make full use of the system, players will need to be proactive in taking control of each individual character to ensure they not only gain ATB at a faster rate, but also spend it. And they then, in the heat of the battle, need to keep an eye on 3 very small pips that appear next to 3 characters that in no way denote when it's possible to perform a synergy ability. That only comes via opening the command menu and seeing the UI have a very subtle visual change. It's understandable that the developers wanted to find ways to encourage players to explore the various characters they spent time and effort crafting, but the implementation of the synergy abilities feels like it could do with some further optimization. That said, Rebirth in general does do a much better job of forcing players to learn how to use characters as the scenario progresses, and it does this by locking them into scenarios where Cloud, for example, is unplayable. A further extension to the synergy system comes via synergy skills. Unlike abilities, skills do not consume synergy when used. Instead, they are more akin to standard abilities. They must also be learned via the folio system, and each character can select 2 offensive skills and 2 defensive skills. It's a neat system in theory, and it feels tailor-made for advanced players who want to squeeze everything they can out of what is now an even more comprehensive battle system. The only downside to all of this relates to one crucial decision around wider progression. When the Final Fantasy VII Remake project was announced, there was a hope that the games would be interconnected. Nobody really expected there to be a one-to-one transition of items, weapons, and abilities from one game to the other, but the expectation was there that they would at least reference one another. In the build-up to launch, it was shared that this interconnectivity would unfortunately be almost non-existent. It's understandable why the decision was taken, but it's also disappointing, especially considering games like Shenmue, which launched so long ago, used this to great effect. Between Shenmue 1 and 2, money accrued would transfer over, as well as collectibles and any abilities Ryu had learnt. This then made it exciting for players, as they would be given the option to either play the game from scratch, or pick up where they left off and have their first playthrough be akin to a New Game Plus off the bat. With Rebirth choosing to ignore everything players accomplished in Remake, it's a bit hard to swallow. You go from having Tifa be a one-woman wrecking machine that can destroy Vice in just over 20 seconds, to a Tifa who has almost all of her abilities removed with no narrative context provided. And to then pour salt in the wound, it can take tens of hours to relearn those abilities just to get back to where you were at the end of the previous game. Similar to Remake, Rebirth is split into numerous chapters, but whereas before, where some of the exploratory chapters were quite restrictive, allowing for limited exploration and side quests that were locked to being completed in that specific passage of play, Rebirth is a lot more flexible. You can, for example, revisit old areas almost whenever you want, and because of this, side quests can also be completed at your leisure. Much of this is facilitated because the world is split into numerous regions, and each region has small hubs. You can traverse these locations by foot or by chocobo, but fast travel is also available. Each region feels inherently unique, and this doesn't just relate to the visual style or other presentation aspects. Calm, for example, is quite open, with lush fields that are filled with vibrant colours. There are nooks and crannies to explore, but everything is very accessible without too much trouble. Later regions are quite different, with environmental puzzles that need to be traversed, something that is facilitated by the numerous types of chocobos that can be acquired as the journey continues. There's also plenty of stuff to do. Whenever you venture into a new region, there are 5 core activities that can be completed. These are assigned by Chadley and classified as World Intel, and although they can be found through natural exploration, activating the Remnant Towers in each region, which serves as one of the 5 aforementioned activities, will highlight them on the map. Collecting World Intel starts off as an intriguing task, but as you venture to more and more regions, it does start to become a bit monotonous, and this is due to the lack of variety. There's nothing revolutionary here. Each activity simply involves going to a specified location and either interacting with something or fighting against a unique variant of regional monster. The only major exception in the core roster of recurring tasks is the Mock House. Each Mock House acts as a timed puzzle game where a small group of troublesome Moogles need to be herded into a specific area. But the challenge does get elevated, and it serves as a fun distraction. To try and counteract the monotony, that's where the Proto-Relic side quest comes into play. We won't delve too deep into this due to who it's connected to and what the Proto-Relic quest involves, but needless to say, each single region has a unique arm to this quest that is geared around a specific set of characters and challenges. In Junon, for example, it has an intimate link to Fort Condor, the minigame that first appeared within Intermission. Not every region hits the same heights, and it does again start to lose a bit of steam, but it's safe to say that the final arc of the Proto-Relic quest will serve as a significant gameplay challenge. Alongside gathering world intel, players can also undertake numerous side quests. These are often related to the various hubs that can be found within the regions, and they are used as a way of reintroducing characters from Remake in meaningful ways or for building out the wider lore. In this regard, one of the major changes is that you can now ask questions to the quest giver, and these questions can be used to better understand their own character motivations or to provide context around something that happened in the region, such as the Junon War. One aspect that's also quite neat is that due to it being possible to complete side quests almost whenever you want, they are context sensitive to where you are in the story. This means dialogue will change to reflect the nature of events, and this could relate to character names changing or simply that you've already fulfilled the requirements. In that regard, it's kind of similar to how Metal Gear Solid 5 handled side tasks, with NPCs seemingly reacting on the fly to the news that you were one step ahead. Now, there has been a lot of discourse around side quests in Final Fantasy games over the past 4 years, with Remake and Final Fantasy XVI provoking the ire of gamers who have had their expectations raised by playing other games. For many, Rebirth will again fall short, and there are some real duds in there, such as a specific quest where you have to coax some chickens with a can. But Rebirth does serve as a definite improvement over Remake, and the characters who reappear end up leaving a more positive impression as a result. Also found within the hub areas are Queen's Blood players. Similar to Final Fantasy VIII and IX, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth features a brand new card game, and it has a surprising level of depth. Players are able to place cards from left to right as they seek to steal territory from their opponent and generate a higher in-lane score. It means placement is very important, but due to the way Queen's Blood has been deployed, there are plenty of strategic nuances, and the game accommodates numerous deck types, including on reveal and destruction. The other surprising aspect around Queen's Blood is that it's more than just a casual distraction. It features its own questline that involves the defeating of not just a specific quantity of players, but also specific bosses, and when milestones are achieved, narrative sequences are even delivered. This then serves as a solid example of what Rebirth is all about. It goes above and beyond to try and surpass expectations, and this is then further evidenced by the sheer volume of minigames and distractions that feature as the journey continues. Rebirth features, quite frankly, a ridiculous number of minigames. Some of these relate to the aforementioned Proto-Relic questline, and there is of course Queen's Blood. But the developers have literally thrown the proverbial kitchen sink to recreate popular minigames from the original Final Fantasy VII, reimagine minigames that appeared in Remake, and also come up with some brand new ones. Costa del Sol and the Gold Saucer do serve as minigame hubs, but they are littered throughout the game, and inspiration has been taken from everywhere. It means you'll see classic carnival games appearing alongside the famed G-Bike, and one of the mini-games was even not so subtly inspired by Fall Guys. What's impressive is that many of these mini-games also have multiple layers. It's not just a case of playing one round and being done. There are numerous difficulty options available, and just when you think you've mastered a mini-game, many will unlock hard mode to up the ante even further. Chocobo racing, like Queen's Blood, also features in a pretty significant way. There are numerous tracks to enjoy, and each Chocobo comes with unique abilities and stats. They can also be enhanced by whatever pieces of armor your Chocobo wears, which can be adjusted at the Choco Boutique. That this minigame features so much depth is just really impressive. They didn't need to create as comprehensive a minigame as they did, but they chose to do it anyway. Compared to Remake, it means Rebirth represents a substantial upgrade in almost every area. And when it comes to general structure and the volume and quality of side content available to players, it means Remake feels more like an expanded tech demo when compared to Rebirth. For the sake of transparency, whereas Remake took around 30 hours to complete when we reviewed it 4 years ago, and this included completing all optional side content, the equivalent playthrough of Rebirth took around 70 hours. Yes, 70 hours. And the crazy thing is that there was still so much more to do. As with Remake, it's only once completing the game that a lot of extra challenge-based content unlocks. This, of course, includes hard mode and hunting down those elusive extra manuscripts to max out weapons and characters. But there's also the hard versions of each minigame, and a ton of combat challenges that appear within the various Colosseum equivalents, including Chadley's VR simulator. It's pretty incredible, and it's a testament to the general ethos of the development team. Not everything lands, and there is a degree of monotony in there, but this has been plaguing open world games in general, and it isn't a Rebirth specific problem. Where Rebirth excels isn't how it attempts to imitate the design principles of other popular open world and sandbox games. It's instead with its more quirky, optional content, and thankfully, there's enough of that to distract from the more arbitrary objectives of going to a specific place on the map and interacting with an object. Now, Final Fantasy VII Remake became notorious for graphical oddities that made it into the final product, with much focus placed around a specific door within the Sector 5 slums. Many of these oddities were fixed when Remake launched on the PlayStation 5, but it meant there was always going to be heavy scrutiny for Rebirth at launch. Rebirth does feature the same standard graphical options, Quality Mode and Performance Mode. Quality Mode focuses on providing better visuals while being capped at 30 frames per second, whereas Performance Mode reduces visual quality to push for 60 frames per second. There are, of course, differences between the two, and those playing Performance Mode will notice a clear blur in comparison to Quality Mode. But in the wider context, the visual enhancements between Remake and Rebirth are quite minimal. Rebirth still features a mix of high and low resolution textures, and there were even concerns around this following the release of specific trailers in the build up to launch, as models and assets were not rendering in the correct manner. And you'll see this when playing the game, as character models can just look out of place due to how low resolution they sometimes are by comparison. One of the challenges this time around has just been the sheer scale, and that's where Rebirth does deserve to be cut some slack. Whereas Remake was quite condensed due to its focus on just Midgar, Rebirth is the polar opposite. It features huge pseudo-open world areas that each have contrasting visual styles, and even the numerous towns and locations have a specific aesthetic. The challenge is that everything looks great on the surface, but it's clear that compromises have had to be made in order to accommodate for the sheer scale of Rebirth, and when you start looking a bit closer, those compromises start to become quite apparent. Taking the positives here though, Rebirth is a very bright and colourful game, serving as a complete contrast to Remake, and at no point does the game look terrible. It just doesn't perhaps represent the visual jump people might have been expecting from a game that is the successor to a game from the previous console generation that launched 4 years ago. Voice acting, on the other hand, remains stellar. Even though there was much consternation around the decision to recast every single role for the English production, the new array of performers have managed to embody their characters with a high degree of success. And this has to be commended, as it's not easy to follow in the footsteps of an already successful ensemble cast. Rebirth also takes this a step further in some regards, and Max Mittelman, for reasons that will not be disclosed in this review, deserves specific praise here. But real credit also has to be applied to John Eric Bentley and Susie Young for how much they throw into their respective characters of Barrett Wallace and Yuffie Kisaragi. Each had to tackle moments that flew through a range of different emotions, and in the case of Barrett, it's even more impressive due to how specific sequences were handled, but also because of the role Barrett plays within the group. The same sentiment can also be applied to the music. The original Final Fantasy VII soundtrack, composed by Nobuo Uematsu, has become iconic, and it was the job of countless composers and arrangers who worked on Remake to attempt to stay faithful to the source material while also modernizing and expanding it. Rebirth has been given the same treatment. Over 400 pieces of music have been produced by a collection of almost 40 composers and arrangers. And when you break it down like that, it's hard not to be blown away by the sheer scale of the endeavour. What's being produced this time has a core spine. Each region plays thematically relevant arrangements that are based around, say, the Final Fantasy VII main theme or the Chocobo theme. And we've already heard some new adaptations of the classic battle theme, such as the music that accompanies the fight against the Materia Keeper. This particular track is incredibly representative of the approach taken. Even though it starts out sounding quite similar to battle theme arrangements that were already produced for Remake, it develops into a wholly original arrangement that incorporates many other relevant themes from the original soundtrack. Beyond that, it introduces appropriate and unorthodox instrumentation in just the right way, and even adapts some of the quintessential leitmotifs as a way of highlighting character sentiment that exists during this particular passage of play. In short, the whole track is 8 minutes of incredible arranging by Shotaro Shima. But there are also numerous original tracks that have been composed, and some of these, such as those associated with the Junon region, were released as part of the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth vinyl album. Yoshinori Nakamura, based on credits from the vinyl album, was given ownership of this region. And what they composed features plenty of personality that shines through the use of specific melodies and instrumentation. Whereas the Junon region theme features both sprawling orchestral passages and a rather poignant choice of instrument for the melodic lead, Under Junon takes the opposite approach. Perhaps to denote its status, a similar instrument was chosen for the melodic lead, but it has a much softer tone, and the accompaniment then reflects this with an acoustic guitar preferred to a bombastic orchestra. These serve as just 3 specific examples, but there are so many more found throughout the soundtrack. It's also impressive how much variety there is in terms of genre, and with plenty of older tracks returning, it means the Rebirth soundtrack is a real treat on the ears. That then brings us on to the story, which is an interesting topic to discuss. By the conclusion of Remake, it was clear that the developers had decided to take the project in a specific direction that went beyond simply padding out some elements of the original story to provide additional context. It's safe to say that not everyone was happy with this decision, but what it created was a general sense of intrigue. Even though veterans would still have the inside scoop and would be prepared for what may happen, it meant they were just as much in the dark as new players as to how and why the story will progress in the manner it does. Rebirth doubles down on this approach, using bold storytelling that pays tribute to and references the original game, but goes above and beyond to create something that's more original. In the build-up, Yoshinori Kitase said that even though the ordering of events may change in subtle ways, Rebirth would still follow the same core path as the original game. And this is true. Many of the narrative milestones from the original game are still there. But as Rebirth also diverges, it means the reasons for following the path may be adjusted, and this applies on both a macro and micro level. It always felt like this was a possibility based on how Remake concluded, and the numerous statements that have been made by the development team. But with Rebirth, it feels like the shackles are off. They made their decision, and they're running with it. For the most part, this is very positive. New characters and motivations are introduced that are in keeping with the new narrative that's being presented. And if you were in the camp that enjoyed what Remake did and where the story went, Rebirth will be an absolute treat. Part of the reason this all works so well is due to the character dynamics. One of the major differences between Remake and Rebirth is the addition of Yuffie. After being introduced, Yuffie often helps to lighten the mood by either being part of a joke or by displaying a relentless passion for the pursuit of materia that supersedes anything else that might be happening. This is then enhanced by the dynamic that Yuffie builds with Barrett. It's both heartwarming and comical at the same time, as their two juxtaposing personalities go head to head. Another highlight has to be Elena. Serving as another addition this time around, Elena often steals the show due to the boldness of her personality and the general lack of filter. As mentioned earlier, the story also looks to include minor characters from Remake in meaningful ways, and this also includes compilation characters that have now been integrated. Sometimes this is delivered via optional side content, but these characters can also appear within the main story path too. Due to how the content is delivered, it leaves a more positive impression this time around. The characters just feel more human and realistic in terms of their motivations, and this allows them to be better understood. But one of the main reasons for this is again the dynamics. Each of them plays off the relationship they built with Cloud in Remake to build and create a more meaningful relationship this time around. Part of this is down to how humour is handled in Rebirth. Remake had some funny moments, and the Wall Market was an absolute treat in this regard. But Rebirth takes everything much further by promoting the antics of comic relief characters and just dialing everything up a notch. This element was always present within the earlier Final Fantasy games, and the developers often had a field day by incorporating exaggerated animations and expressive text. Transitioning over to more realistic graphics and storytelling devices made it difficult for this kind of humour to translate, but Rebirth does a stand-up job of trying to retain this aspect of the original Final Fantasy VII. But on the other side, when Rebirth needs to get serious, it can get very serious. In the original game, this passage of the story contains some real, heartfelt narrative moments, as characters end up having to face elements of their past. And while they don't all land in quite the same way as they did within the original game, the implementation is commendable. The only slight downside is that because of how the story has chosen to be handled, with there being specific cherry picking from the wider compilation as opposed to wholesale adoption, some characters do feel a bit swindled in this regard. Each of them has been given extensive backstories as the compilation has built out, but the scenario writers chose to try and keep some elements contained to what was only known about within the Remake continuity. It's understandable why this was the case, but for those who know, it does lessen the emotional impact somewhat. In terms of how the story concludes though, and sets up what's to follow, well, it's definitely intriguing. After the release of Remake, it was always felt like it would be difficult to judge the individual parts of the project, as they're each just a piece of the larger puzzle. And it's only when the third game releases and concludes that we'll be able to see whether the decisions they've made, in terms of how they've changed and modified the story, turn out to be good ones. What can be said, however, is that the events that transpire at the conclusion of Rebirth only further add to the mystery. And those who love delving into theories are going to have even more of a field day this time around than they did after Remake. In conclusion, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth builds upon the foundations that were established with Remake in a meaningful way to make something that is so much bigger and better. The reality is that Rebirth dwarfs Remake in terms of quality and quantity of content. And although some clear compromises have had to be made in terms of graphical performance to compensate for this, it's worth the price of admission. The minigames alone are pretty incredible, and it's still hard to fathom not just how they managed to pack so many in, but how they managed to maintain the quality. Gameplay also holds up, and the new characters feel like solid additions to the lineup. You'll need to use them throughout too, as Rebirth features a plethora of compelling and challenging boss encounters, and with the prospect of hard mode and a boatload of tailor-made combat challenges, it's sure to keep players occupied for some time. The jury is still out in terms of the merits of the wider story changes, but everything that featured within Rebirth did so in a manner that was faithful and respectful to the source material where it needed to be. And some of the new character dynamics were also really heartwarming. It just means though that after watching the conclusion of Rebirth, the same curiosity remains. Curiosity as to how they're going to conclude this project with the final part and have everything make sense, and how they're going to top what can only be considered to be an otherwise stellar effort this time around. With that though, thank you for watching all the way through to the end. It's always an immense privilege to be able to share our thoughts about Final Fantasy games with all of you in this manner. So thank you for choosing to check out the review and honestly for your general support of the channel. The fact that we have over 300,000 subscribers now is absolutely insane. So thank you for putting your faith in us. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent and Sukin TDK, who are super special Onion Note supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.